Our gospel reading, you might have noticed, ends with a cryptic statement that seems to come out of nowhere. Having witnessed Jesus walking on water and calming yet another storm, Mark writes that the disciples, quote, were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I mean, what does walking on water have to do with loaves of bread? And how would understanding the loaves of bread lead the disciples to grasp Jesus' actions that evening? Well, if you were here last week, you'll have some clue as to what Mark is talking about. In the moments that immediately preceded our passage, Jesus fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Moreover, the disciples were completely aware of the miraculous nature of what had just occurred. Mark's commentary then at the end of our passage shows us that despite witnessing this, though, the disciples missed the significance behind it. Without going too far down a rabbit trail, the feeding of the 5,000 revealed Jesus as the same God who miraculously fed and provided for Israel thousands of years earlier. In short, it showed Jesus' true identity as God in the flesh. If the disciples understood this, Mark is saying, the events on the Sea of Galilee would have been different. So this got me to thinking, how would our gospel reading be different if the disciples had understood the significance of the loaves? To ask it another way, how would the disciples' actions change if they believed Jesus to be God? By imagining this in their lives, we'll get some hints as to how Jesus' true identity as God can impact us as well. So Mark begins, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, because we often read this passage as its own separate story, we can miss the force of this opening verse. You see, when we connect it to the feeding of the 5,000 that immediately preceded it, we get a sense of urgency in Jesus' actions. In fact, let's read the verse again while connecting it to the one before it. Mark says, "And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat." See what I mean? Jesus feeds the multitudes and then immediately, forcefully sends the disciples across the sea. What gives? Well, John's account fills in the blanks when he says, when the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they said, "This is a prophet who has come into the world." And perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Simply put, in seeing Jesus provide for the crowd in such a miraculous way, the crowds were rising up to make him their leader, deliverer, and king by force. So, sensing the danger of this situation, both in terms of the disciples' physical but also spiritual well-being, Jesus sends them off. Now, I've never thought about it this week, but this would have been a confusing and anxious moment for the disciples. For one thing, they shared many of the crowd's expectations for Jesus. Some of them were most likely thinking, "This is the moment we've been waiting for, Jesus. You are going to reveal yourself as king who will free us from Rome." As a result of this, his actions must have confounded them. More than this, though, unruly crowds are quite scary, especially when they've numbered 5,000 plus. And seeing seeing them try and make Jesus king by force, well, he's forcefully sending you off on a boat, well, that would have been anxious. This said, how might the disciples have experienced this event differently if they understood the significance of the loaves? How would knowing that Jesus is God in the flesh inform their emotions as he compelled them to leave? Although they would have been bewildered and somewhat anxious concerning this series of confusing events, underneath it all, they would have been instilled with the knowledge that Jesus is God and he knows what he's doing right now. I mean, I could hear the understanding disciple saying to himself, though Jesus' idea of kingship and running the world differs from mine. And though I can't understand why he's forcing me to get into this boat, I can trust him because he's God and he has this. See the difference? Knowing Jesus as God would not have altered the uncomfortable circumstance, but would have provided the disciples with a foundation to traverse it in faith. Continuing, Mark sets the scene for Jesus' trek in the water, writing, "And after Jesus had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out in the sea, and he was alone on the land." So there you have it, the calm before the storm. Mark continues, "And Jesus saw that the disciples were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them." As I mentioned several weeks ago when Jesus calmed the storm before, due to its typography, the Sea of Galilee often erupts in violent windstorms without notice. Storms like these, called sharkia or shark in modern times, could scare the wits of even the most experienced fishermen and even endanger their lives. This said, notice that their plight does not escape Jesus' notice. Whether seeing them from afar or somehow mysteriously in a sort of omniscient way, Jesus is well aware of their struggle. The disciples, though, having mixed what transpired with the loaves and failing to see that Jesus is God, they believed themselves to be alone, at the mercy of the wind and the waves. Already unsettled by their abrupt and forced departure, the disciples believed they're knocking on death's door, all by themselves. For all they know, Jesus is either oblivious or he's been trampled by the crowds. They believe to be alone. Once again, think about how this experience would have been different if the disciples had understood Jesus' true identity as God, as revealed in the loaves. As it was with the abrupt departure, facing the storm still would have been an anxious moment. Moreover, it would have been physically demanding to the extent that Mark can still write that they were making headway painfully. Literally in the Greek, he says they're making headway in torment. However, knowing of Jesus, or knowing that Jesus is God, would have provided them a foundation to sail the rough waters in faith. Though my God is not visibly with me, the disciple could think, he knows my plight and will do what he sees fit. Though I desire to be rescued, if it be his will for me to perish in the storm, I will still commend myself to his care. Continuing, Mark writes that upon seeing the disciples in torment, Jesus approaches them in the most unexpected way. Between 3 and 6 a.m., Mark says that Jesus came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. First, walking on the sea. This goes without saying. This is absolute God stuff here. The Old Testament often depicted God in this way, treading the waters. So Jesus is sending the disciples an unmistakable message here. Second, what's with the whole Jesus meaning to pass the disciples by part? Well, once again, this is charged Old Testament language here. Here's a sampling to give you an idea. Upon giving further revelation to Moses, Exodus says that Yahweh passed by him. Similarly, before Elijah heard the still small voice of God, the book of 1 Kings says that, behold, Yahweh passed by him. All this to say that in passing them by, Jesus attended his disciples to see him treading the waves as only God could, and thus know that he's more than a prophet, teacher, healer, and even bread multiplier. He desired to reveal himself further as the Lord of creation, the one who, to quote the book Isaiah, makes a way in the sea and a path in the mighty waters. In doing this, the disciples would have had their fears stilled amid the stormy waters. However, because they failed to recognize Jesus' identity as revealed in the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples couldn't recognize Jesus on the water. Mark writes, when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they saw him and were terrified. Imagine how the scene would have been different if the disciples understood Jesus' identity as revealed in the loaves. Already aware that their Lord knows their plight, they would have recognized him as he treaded the waters. Sure, they would have experienced holy fear, but knowing the heart of the one they saw, they would have cried out to him for rescue rather than crying out in panic. So back to our passage, Jesus responds to the disciples' doubt, fear, and superstition with a grace-filled revelation of his identity. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Though somewhat ambiguous in the English, the Greek in this passage is an emphatic declaration of Jesus' identity. The phrase, it is I, is ego eimi in the Greek, and it's a form of the very name of God that Moses heard from the burning bush. From the Greek Old Testament of the time, God said to Moses, I am who I am, ego eimi, aon. Thus, Jesus is not merely doing what only God can do by walking on water. He's also identifying himself with God's very name to calm the disciples' fears. Sadly, though, they still don't get it. Mark concludes, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. In other words, as it was with the loaves, they were perplexed and astonished by what Jesus had done, but they were still missing God in the flesh right in front of them. If they had understood Jesus' rescue, would have been a moment of praise, similar to what we heard in the psalmody this morning. Give thanks to Yahweh, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Him who spread the earth out above the waters, his steadfast love endures forever. So that's how this morning's gospel reading would have been different if the disciples understood the significance of the loaves. Though the storm and even Jesus' rescue would have been an anxious and difficult situation to be sure, knowing that Jesus is God in the flesh would have given the disciples a foundation to traverse that moment in faith, trusting that no matter what happens, Jesus is God, and he's working all things together for the ultimate good of those who believe. So think about your own life. How might you experience your various storms differently if you approach them with the understanding that Jesus is God in the flesh? Well, as it is for the disciples, so it is for you. Knowing that Jesus is God in the flesh provides a foundation to traverse difficult moments in life and in faith. For example, I think about Mark's description of the disciples' boating difficulties. They were making headway in torment. I don't know about you, but that description suits much of life, especially life over the past 2 years. Whether it's health issues, financial woes, anxieties, schooling troubles, boredom, frustrations, marital strife, or forfeited dreams, making headway in life is arduous, to say the least. This said, living in the knowledge that Jesus is God provides us with a situation provides us with a foundation to traverse our stormy lives in faith. As Jesus saw the torment of his disciples amid the storm, so he sees and knows your struggles. As he came to his disciples, treading on the water, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," so he reveals himself to you in word and sacrament, that you may know the same. Finally, as he entered the boat and calmed the storm surrounding the disciples, so Jesus enters your life and is working all things together for his purposes, which are for your ultimate good. Though it won't be as instantaneous as it was for the disciples, the fruit of his work will be as unmistakably obvious in eternity. So whatever storms you find yourself in right now, take heart, Jesus is God in the flesh. Do not be afraid. He who walked on the water also walked the dark path to the cross to save us. He sees, knows, is present, and will rescue us from our plights. But when rescue seems a long time coming, may knowing that Jesus is God give you a foundation to traverse life's storms in faith, trusting that he who saved you is working all things together for your ultimate good. Let us pray. God, we thank you for your love as is revealed in the scriptures, and we thank you that you unmistakably today show us that the love of Christ is also the love of God. Help us as we traverse our stormy lives, sometimes even in torment, to believe that he is good, to believe that he sees us, to believe that he is coming to us, and to believe that he is with us, working all things together for our good. We ask this all in his name. Amen.